So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and depending on from where you're dialing in, very warm welcome and thank you for joining our breakout session today. The supply chain is increasingly considered as a backbone of humanitarian operations, and at the same time, it's a complex system which brings together many different actors, including humanitarian agencies, suppliers, transport providers, and national governments. Making humanitarian supply chains more sustainable without compromising on the effectiveness of humanitarian assistance requires joint efforts, global standards, policies, and possibly, most importantly, practical solutions. So the aim of this session is to present and discuss some of the opportunities that are out there. We have invited 4 experts from different sectors to give an elevator speech at the beginning with practical examples and operational insights and on how to make your supply chain more sustainable. Moritz will be setting the scene by giving us a more high-level overview on sustainability in supply chain operations. Matthew will be putting the discussion into the humanitarian context, followed by Edgar and Paul, who will present to you very concrete opportunities on how to reduce emissions. In the second half of the session, we shall have time for several questions you might have for the speakers, but also interactive active discussions amongst the audience. But before we start, we kindly ask you to answer 2 Mentimeter questions that should give us and yourself a better idea who else is in the room. We advise you to use your phone, so then actually you can follow on your computer screen the results. So may I kindly ask you to go to menti.com, type in the code that is on the screen, and then answer firstly the question, what sector are you representing? And then a second question shortly after. Okay, let's wait 10 more seconds. So anyone who still wants to participate, I think we have a clear trend. 50% humanitarian organizations, 50% from outside, commercial sector, 25 from academia, 25%. Okay, then I would suggest we jump to the next question. So what's your motivation to attend this session? Firstly, understanding the role of sustainability in humanitarian supply chains, to more learn about ongoing activities and initiatives, engage with other actors on the topic of sustainability, or even like become more concrete to identify takeaways and recommendations to be implemented. Okay, excellent. We have a fairly nice split, desire to learn, but also to identify concrete takeaways. So that's perfect. We will now move on to the elevator speeches, and then we have also prepared a few questions towards the end. So kindly ask you to just leave the Menti site or app open till the end of the session, and we come back to answer a few more questions, which will also then give us the platform for some follow-up activities beyond that session. So now I'm just looking where Moritz is. Celine?
I'm here again.
Ah, you're back. Perfect.
The internet broke down for a while. That was a bit stressful, to be honest, for a minute.
Okay, excellent. So we have our first speaker back. So yeah, welcome Moritz. Thanks so much for giving that elevator speech to the group here. And handing over now, the floor is yours. So I just stop sharing my screen and then you can share yours, okay?
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will share this one. And I guess you can see it now, right?
You can, yes. Thanks.
All right, fine. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. My name is Moritz Petersen. I'm a researcher from Kuehne Logistics University. I was just a week ago appointed to be a new assistant professor of sustainable supply chain practice, and I'm also the director of the Center for Sustainable Logistics and Supply Chain, which also was founded 2 weeks ago. So Jonas asked me to give an introductory short speech about the basics of sustainable supply chains. And he gave me long lists of things that he wanted me to bring across. And I said, fine, give me 8 hours, no problem. And he said, well, 10 minutes, that enough. So it has to be an elevator ride, a pretty long one, to be honest, but I'll try to keep it short. So, I mean, it's about the basics, right? So we start with I guess the audience is, as we saw, coming from very different domains. So why not start with what a supply chain actually is? And to put it very simple, it's a network of companies, of a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to an end consumer. And this can be a private person, but obviously also in the humanitarian context, a person in need. And these different companies are connected by a material flow, right? So the materials that are worked on and well, transformed into the product. And this material flow is essentially the logistics activities, right? Which we'll hear a lot about in this session. And then there is an information flow because the orders get passed upstream the supply chain while the material flow flows downstream the supply chain. So that's the very short version of what a supply chain is. And then, well, sustainability, we've all heard that, I guess. It's nothing new. But what is a definition that I still find captures the idea very well? It is the Brundtland definition from 87, right? The one that talks about sustainable development is sustainable if you achieve, if you take care of the needs of the present, but also allow the future generations to meet their needs. It's a great definition. Also, I mean, I'm an academic. I like definitions, but it's not that easy to operationalize for a supply chain, right? Or for any domain. So that is why I think the Sustainable Development Goals are pretty helpful, because these are targets, right, that should be met. So economic targets like reducing poverty, enabling economic growth, social targets like education, like gender equality, and environmental targets like clean water or, well, climate action. That is what we're all here for. And well, if a supply chain works very well and is set up in a good way, it can contribute to achieving these goals, right? So it enables maybe sustainable development. But if you talk about supply chain sustainability, that's usually not what you want to look into, the positive effect, but more the negative side effects that definitely happen. And well, these negative effects on sustainable development can be governed or should be governed. And how does that work? Well, we like to think of it as this. There is this one large company, a manufacturer, whatever, a large company that's in the spotlight that wants to improve sustainability and wants to pass some environmental and social standards to its suppliers. And well, then we like to think that the supplier passes similar or the same standards to its suppliers and so on, right? So that you have in the end, or that's the idea, cascading sustainable practices throughout the supply chain. Well, does that work? It's a nice idea, but sadly not really. So if you look into the press, you see scandals happening with first-tier suppliers, not the supplier, but with the first tier that are directly controlled by the manufacturers, happening every day. Well, maybe not every day, but all the time. So memorable incidents were like Adidas and Nike, right? Their suppliers were accused of dumping toxins into rivers, right, in clothing manufacturing. Or on the right side, this is a factory of Foxconn, so a supplier for Dell and HP and Apple. And they were accused of well, having pretty hazardous labor conditions in their factories. And remember, this is the first tier suppliers of these huge companies that pass these standards on. And well, low tier suppliers, the situation there is almost always worse. And sustainability managers from large companies consider them often as, well, as time bombs, because you don't really know what's going on there in terms of environmental issues and social issues. And so why doesn't it work to pass on these standards or, well, expectations of the focal company to their suppliers? Well, first of all, sometimes the manufacturers are the problem themselves, because they place orders that can't be met, that are unrealistic in terms of volume, in terms of deadline. And the first tier supplier worries that if they would say we can't do it, the manufacturing company would go somewhere else and would find someone who's able to do that. So this opens the door for questionable labor practices, right? Then the first tier suppliers themselves struggle. So how should they put sustainability standards onto the lower tier suppliers if they are no role model themselves, right? And then from the manufacturing company's perspective, they often have no contractual relationship with the low tier suppliers. So they if they know them, they couldn't go there and say, well, please adhere to this standard or this standard. And finally, these low tier suppliers, they are not known. They are not in the public spotlight. And also they have the least resources in the entire chain to really look into sustainability issues and to care for improving the situation there. And finally, and that is one thing one should always remember, I mean, this supply chain picture with the 4 companies linked to each other is not the reality, right? So first of all, it should be a network. If you look or start with the manufacturer, right? It doesn't have one supplier, but many, and those suppliers have many suppliers as well. And then finally, these low tier suppliers also play a part in different supply chains, in different industries for very different OEMs or manufacturers, right? So a car manufacturer might have a seat maker and they might have a phone manufacturer. But this phone manufacturer might also be engaged in other supply chains, and the car supply chain might only make up for a small percentage of its business. So they have diverging sustainability standards and expectations, and well, might not be able to sort them all out. And also, if the car supply chain is only a very small part of their business, why should they listen to the car manufacturer and not focus on the chains where they make the most business, right? So everyone has their own standards and ways of enforcing that. So what can you do for approaches that might help? Also with respect to emissions, and we'll come to emissions in the next elevator speeches more specifically, and you will recognize some of these strategies of these 4 in the other elevator speeches. So first of all, there's the direct approach. So the manufacturer could ask its first tier supplier to actively look into the sustainability performance of the low tier suppliers, right? So it could set targets and monitor them with respect to their engagement on sustainability with the low tier suppliers. They could delegate this, the indirect approach, right? They say, you take care of it, but we won't measure and steer that, but you make sure that you do it. There is a collective approach where a manufacturer could collaborate with its large first-tier suppliers, with its competitors from the industry, to develop standards that are used throughout the industry, and through these standard, then the sustainability practices maybe could trickle down through the supply network. And finally, they could reach out to NGOs or other international organizations to collaborate with them on standards, on improving the situation, also with low-tier suppliers, right? So reaching beyond their immediate supply chain or industry to other organizations. So what does that mean for you, right? That you work in most of you, I guess, in humanitarian supply chains? Well, first of all, public attention is growing for many of these sustainability issues. We've been saying that for decades, to be honest, right? Now the consumer wants more sustainable products or low emission products, whatever. Well, there is a social desirability bias at play, and it's still there. But you can see also with the Fridays for Future demonstration that there is at least a segment of the population that now really pushes for that. Public attention could also mean donors, right, that go into that direction, that want you to improve and take care of sustainability in your supply chain. And maybe also crucial, well, regulation has been asleep at the wheel for a while. So as an academic, I'm maybe allowed to say that, but well, I think that's the case. So there were standards, but there were no ways of actually enforcing them or punishing supply chains or companies that don't adhere to these standards. And now if you look around, there have been two recent initiatives, one from the UK and one from Germany, that actually want to try to punish, well, companies if they don't adhere to the standards. And not the suppliers, but the focal company that is active on the market and sells to the consumer. So in the UK, it's more focused on deforestation. But in Germany, at least that's the aim. It's in discussion, and well, we'll see what comes out of it. But it's the first attempt to actually implement something like that. And well, we know that regulation is not always best for the companies, but also not always best for the cause, right? So better make sure that you are not forced to do that, but look into that yourself. Well, and putting it together, well, there is a strong mandate to really push sustainability in your organization and supply chain. And well, we hope that this session will help you to identify some, well, best practices, areas to look into, and or give you some impetus to well, push that in your organization further. Well, that's it for me. So I hope the elevator is now at the top. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Moritz, for that comprehensive overview and for setting so perfectly the scene for the following speakers. I'm sure there's already quite some questions in the audience, but as said before, keep them for the second part of the session, and then we will actually come back to all the speakers and you can ask your questions directly to them. So next, I would kindly invite Matthew to now bring us from the more general overview on sustainability supply chain into the humanitarian context. So I think he will also briefly introduce himself and then give us some really interesting insights from the Red Cross movement, Red Crescent movement, what actually they are doing in that field. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Jenna. So we'll start sharing my screen, and just let me know if everything works appropriately, and let's start from the beginning. So I'm very pleased to be amongst you today. I'm Matthew Grenade, as you said. I'm working for the Danish Red Cross as regional supply chain coordinator for the Euro-Asia region. And I'm also overlooking at the supply chain and sustainability supply chain component of what we call the Green Working Group. I was born and raised in Greece. It's a beautiful town on the Atlantic Ocean. And actually, I have no doubt that's where comes from my passion for the ocean, nature, environment in general, which is actually my first field of study, and which I reinforce afterwards with procurement MBA and some supply chain degrees in sustainable green supply chain and degrees. So as you can say, I'm a lucky person. I've been able to connect my passion throughout my study, but also in my work in my environment. Since I'm working for the Red Cross, I've been trusted by the management to push forward the sustainability agenda amongst our supply chain, and also by my peers. So it's very inspiring for me very motivating, and a true purpose for myself. So actually, that's why I'm here today, to let you know about and to give you some insight about this long journey that we embarked on towards greening our supply chain, be more environmental friendly, what we have done so far, and what we would like to do, and to discuss that with you. So concretely, what have we done about it? Well, actually, I would say that a little bit of history within the humanitarian and the movement, decarbonizing our supply chain is not new. Actually, that is something that exists within the movement, at least since 2010. We've studied from the IFRC in regards to a prepositioning impact on carbon emissions, and also for the French Red Cross that studied their operational impact in terms of carbon emission during the Haiti earthquake in 2010, actually. So at that time, I have to say that this was mainly initiatives from individual within the organization. So a very bottom-up approach, but it was worth the effort, and the message has been heard by the management and the high management, but actually totally embarked in this journey, and is very supportive, as we can see today with this summit. Definitely, it was also very good results, and we decided to be, in a sense, more holistic and strategic, and to tackle the approach on a more systematic, in a more systematic way. So what have we done for that? We developed a program to better understand what was our supply chain like in terms of emission. So what we did, we firstly developed and created an emission baseline. So for us to understand the different hotspots within our supply chain. We also benchmarked our practices with other humanitarian actors, but not only humanitarian actors, but also private sectors company, to understand what was the best practice that could exist elsewhere. And additionally to that, also we looked into indicators to understand what would be the most suitable indicators to report on this impact that we might have, how to monitor them, and yes, how to report them. And finally, most of all, to design a roadmap towards a greener supply chain, and to be more environmental friendly within our activities. So how have we done it? It's quite simple. What we did is we selected our most common relief items. Relief items, it's quite easy for me to understand as a humanitarian, but for the others, that's the goods that we do distribute when we operate to our beneficiaries, so when we act. And these most common ones are, for example, buckets, tents, tarpaulins, jerry cans, mosquito nets, blankets. What we did, we analyzed their emissions in different field studies, operation and emergency operations that we had in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Philippines. So we take this and we analyzed based on an LCA approach, life cycle assessment. To clarify this, it's the analysis of the environmental impact of a product along its life. So this encompasses from the raw material extraction, the manufacturing processes, transportation, storage, usage, and end of life. So actually, that's why we say from cradle to grave. So with this said, let's have a look at the concrete results we had. I will not insist too much on that slide as it's a per item approach, but you can have already an aperçu of the different stages that we studied and the variation among the different items. So what I want is to take a more global view on what we got and what's the story behind the IFRC supply chain carbon footprint. So first of all, and I think it's very important to remind this, the humanitarian logistics or supply chain is geared for speed and to be flexible, and in a sense that might differ from the regular commercial supply chain that we might know. It's normal matter of life savings, so definitely speed is of essence. So nonetheless, and that's the first learning actually that we got, is that when it comes to supply chain and greening the supply chain, it's very similar to the commercial supply chain. I would say that the symptoms are the same, and actually we assume that therefore the medicines will be also the same. So that's the first thing. And to express this commonality amongst these supply chains, I will highlight some few points. Firstly, for IFRC, 70 to 80% of the total organization emission are coming from the supply chain. So definitely that's the first learning. If an organization wants to look into climate change and environmental impact, definitely the supply chain, its supply chain, is a key actor to do so. Then, as you can see, we have here the different stages of our supply chain, from manufacturing to disposal. And when you look at it, you'll see that our main impact belongs to the manufacturing and transport phase within our supply chain. So definitely in the upstream part. At that stage, and here for us in our study, this represents 97% of the emission of our supply chain. So this would drive us into thinking that definitely the upstream part is the main hotspot, and therefore looking at working with our suppliers to either reduce, either change materials or be more innovative, and with our transportation is a way to go. Then the usage, here you see it's 0%. So I want to clarify the fact that within the items we selected, none of them needed electricity, nor fuel, nor were emitting any carbons. That's why the result is nil in our study. And the disposal, which is not as high as we might have expected, actually it's 3%, is also leading us into thinking that our downstream part of our supply chain is not that impacting. In terms of carbon emission, and this will discuss it a little bit further. Also, just to be clear on the disposal, during our study, the option that was taken, because at the time that was the main option used on the field, it's a landfill. And definitely landfill is not very much emitting carbons in its process. So that's also one of the explanations of this low carbon emission in this part and our downstream part. So at that stage, I would like actually to make a focus on disposal throughout the coding example. So it might be a little bit provocative focus, and I will explain a very important message. As we saw, the results would push us to very much focus on the upstream part of our supply chain and leaving aside, in a sense, the downstream part. And that's something that we need to be cautious on. So firstly, tarpaulins, what is it? It's very big sheets that are made of plastic or composed with plastics that we use during our shelter operation. So mainly for roofing, as you can see here on the screen, or to reinforce windows or walls. It's a very commonly used item. But when we look into the detail and in our screening, that the tarpaulins are, I would say, average. They are not the most impacting items. They are not the least impacting items. So why should we very much look into that? I know that, yes, plastic is on the radar for everyone, but is there a reason behind it? And that's what we're going to discuss now is, and we will push it forward and this logic forward with its disposal. Again, if we look at the numbers, the end of life is not that impacting. I remind you that we are discussing carbon emission, not other aspect of the environment impact. So actually, our position is that, yes, we should take care of disposal. Firstly, it's quite obvious. The disposal of proper disposal and waste management of the different items and tarpaulins and plastic are of essence. Firstly, because it has a direct impact on our beneficiaries and on the affected area without slowing the speed of response or its efficiency. That's not impacting our supply chain setup currently. It can be put in place by the relief organization and by the local community also. And this would already avoid hygiene risk or water ground pollution. So there are direct impact that are beneficial. On top of that, waste management and proper disposal has a huge potential in terms of humanitarian work and environmental aspect. Actually, there is a very good example that is working and in place for quite long now, and I invite you to have a look at it after our discussion. It's the Dadaab refugee complex in Kenya, where the community in that camp, with support from the Kenya Red Cross and other partners, do collect plastic within the camp, shred it, and then sell pellets to manufacturer. So here, through a disposal, then we have developed a circular economy, more resilient community. We are acting locally and with the communities, and it can be much more inclusive. So the potential are there, and that's definitely something that we need to remind of at the time of tackling environmental aspect. So the other point I wanted to make is with it and outside also the organization, is that to tackle the environmental aspect and climate change, we need to tackle it from a different angle. That's definitely something that was also the logic behind my presentation. In fact, if we just look into one perspective, which were carbon emission, it can be misleading. It can drive us to make only limited decision and therefore not tackle this aspect in a global perspective. And we would miss a lot of opportunities and we would not bring solution to the world problem. So we have to tackle it from different angle and perspective. Then also something that is very important, and it was touched during your introduction, Jonas, that is something also where, and very important thing, it needs to be done in collaboration we need to develop a collaborative approach within the organization itself, within the humanitarian sector, but not only. We need to go with other sectors, private sector, academia, and governments. All these different actors need to embark and collaborate if we want to reverse this warming curve that we are facing and this issue of climate change and environmental impact from our operation. So actually, I will conclude by summing back a little bit the different takeaway that I think should be the takeaway of my session. Firstly, supply chain is a key actor within an organization when speaking about environment aspect and climate change. It has a direct impact. We have to address the challenge from different perspectives. Just one source of information will not suffice to embrace as a problem. We need to tackle it, therefore, from different perspective and angle to have the more sound decision. And we need to reinforce collaboration within the sector and outside the sector. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Matthew, for putting the discussion into the humanitarian context, for also putting strong focus on the disposal or reverse logistics side. So that I think also fits perfectly with the two remaining speakers that we have, because you also have shown in your overview and your findings that, of course, transport plays a critical role. So the two speakers that are now coming up will be focusing exactly on that transportation side. So we will have Edgar from Kühne+Nagel looking more at the international transport leg, and then Paul will be focusing a bit more on the ground logistics in the field. So Edgar, I think I can actually hand over to you. Maybe just as a side remark, so Kühne+Nagel is just one example, of course, of like many initiatives out there from the commercial sector. So you can look at all the international transport providers, be it DHL, UPS, etc. They all have their sustainability strategies in place. So I think it's okay to say that Kühne+Nagel is one example and representing more or less the sector, giving, I think, you some ideas that when you as a humanitarian agency looking to reduce emissions, there are certainly commercial partners out there you can actually work with. So Edgar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jonas, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the committee and your team for inviting me today. Well, just a short introduction of myself. My name is Edgar Uribe. Originally, I'm from Mexico, working for Kühne+Nagel 12.5 years. I've been in the area of sustainability and environment for about 16, 17 years, but in the supply chain for about 25 years, right? So this is my background, very passionate about sustainability. And since 12 years ago, managing the environmental sustainability program for Kühne+Nagel, right? So I think it's going to be a very interesting overview of how Kühne+Nagel handles sustainability and is embedded now as part of our services, right? So first thing I like to do is to show you an introductory video. So if you allow me, just quickly open it. Just a second. There we go. There we go.
Seven. That's the percentage of CO2 emissions created by our industry globally due to oil-based fuels. That equals the yearly CO2 emissions of 492 million cars. or the yearly CO2 emissions from the use of electricity by 405 million homes. We have to do better. At Kuna & Naga, we are taking action to dramatically lessen our impact by making a bold promise. By 2030, we will be carbon neutral by connecting our customers to sustainable supply chain solutions and our colleagues to sustainable company practices that support our strategy to protect and preserve our shared environment. We will continue to track our carbon footprint, making shipping-related emissions visible in our Sea Explorer and Carbon Calculator platforms. We will give our customers the opportunity to choose a service that produces significantly lower levels of CO2. We will offer carbon-neutral transports to all of our customers. We will offset CO2 that cannot yet be avoided in spite of all our efforts at reduction through reforestation projects, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere in partnership with NGOs from South America to Africa and in support of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Local lands will improve, habitats will be protected and rebuilt, and lives will be made better. As a leading global logistics provider, we have a responsibility to protect the planet we all depend on. Join us.
So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy this introductory video as much as I did, right? So then we go to the point, right? So here in the video, you just learned that Kuna aims to be carbon neutral by 2030, right? So the way we want to achieve this goal is based on the greenhouse gas protocol approach, right? The greenhouse gas protocol is the highest standard on carbon emissions accounting and reporting. So the greenhouse gas protocol tells us, okay, there is a way in which you can cluster your CO2 emissions according to what they call scopes, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions relates to direct emissions yielded from the combustion of fossil fuels, right? Like, for example, our company trucks and company vehicles, right? Then it comes the indirect emissions, which relate to scope number 2, which goes into the purchase of energy, heat, or steam. So anything that we use any energy, electricity, and heating that we use for our warehouses and offices, then goes into the scope number 2, right? So this is somehow under control of Kuna, and this is the reason why Kuna decided to go for these 2 scope emissions as carbon neutral already in 2020. So by the end of 2020, after making our accounting and reporting of the total emissions, right, and looking at different ways we are going to reduce our emissions, whatever remaining emissions then will be offset to be carbon neutral, right? So then it comes scope number 3, which is other indirect emissions, right, which mostly relate to the business travel we do, outsourced suppliers activities, right, transport mainly, and commuting. So this is not under our control, direct control, right? We actually use different transport suppliers, and this makes a little bit more complex that we can actually claim or make this carbon neutral in a short term. This is the reason why Kuna then decided to go for scope 3 emissions completely carbon neutral by 2030, right? So then we have a 10, almost 9 years now term to make this happen, right? So this is in the horizon of our carbon emission program and carbon neutralization program. So just, I mean, what I like to do today is just to go in examples, right? Clear examples on how this is done, how we are actually materialize in this. So for example, in the case of our carriers, which is the most complex part of reducing our carbon emissions and neutralizations, we are actually working together with them, right? So for example, here with CMA, CGM, which is one of our biggest carriers for sea transportation, we're actually already doing projects for using alternative fuels, biofuels, right? And we are also already operating LNG together with CMA, operating LNG, liquefied natural gas containers, right? So this will help us to reduce not only carbon emissions, but also sulfurs. With Maersk, we are also piloting battery systems to improve power production, right? So this is the kind of initiatives that we're doing together with our sea suppliers. We're now talking with our air suppliers and our truck or road logistics suppliers to see what else we can do, right? Sorry, I was going backwards. In addition to that, Kuehne+Nagel is now bringing more attention to policy making, right? So based on that, then we have decided to join different platforms, right, in which Kuehne+Nagel has a voice. The first one here is quite important, because Kuehne+Nagel, apart from being having said that we want to be carbon neutral by 2030, we are adhering our targets to the global Paris Agreement Science-Based Target Initiative, right? We also took the option and to be part of the UN Global Compact, also the Arctic Pledge, Getting to Zero Coalition, Development and Climate Alliance, right? And other initiatives around. So in concrete actions, for example, as a logistics company, we have the possibility to give visibility to our customers, not only on the shipments, right? So before the customer actually books a service with Kuehne+Nagel for sea transportation, we give them the option to select which actual vessel they want to use. So we give them a list of 5, 10, depending on how many carriers are available for a specific lane. We give them the option based on CO2 emissions. So we tell them, okay, dear customer, you're going from Shanghai to New York, you have 8 different vessels, 8 different possibilities. So number one, the CO2 emissions is this fraction, right? Number 2, this other fraction, and number 10 or number 8 is this other fraction. So they can actually evaluate based on the actual grams of CO2 per TU kilometer, which is the most efficient. And they can say, hey, Kuehne+Nagel, you know what? I like a supplier number 5, right? Because it fits with my cost, but also with my expectations on CO2 emissions, right? So this is what we do with the Sea Explorer, right? We give full transparency to our customers on selecting their carrier of their preference. It is a data-driven system which enables decision-making on supply chains. And well, we also give them expertise on our sea logistics platform. Right. I mentioned before, we are actually already not only testing, but we are actually using alternative fuels, in this case, biofuels. So together with CMA, CGA, we are operating vessels on biofuels, right? So this is one other alternative that is being given to our customers. In addition to that, for example, in rail logistics, we open a service which is called KN Eurasia Express, which save times for our customers, save cost as well, but most importantly, reduces up to 90% of CO2 emissions if you compare to air freight transportation, right? There is another alternative, for example, which is Sea Air Service to Dubai, which is the same way, saving time, saving costs, but reduces as low as 50% of the CO2 emissions for transportation. Another alternative that we are giving to our customers is we are actually offering carbon neutral services, completely carbon neutral services. So LCL stands for less than container load, right? So this is a sea transportation service, and any customer that books LCL services with Kuehne + Nagel, then they receive a completely carbon-free service. Okay. Same goes for KM Pledge, which is a similar service, right? And now this is attached to our full container load service. Again, any customer that books a service under KM Pledge receives a carbon neutral service, right? A carbon neutral transport. Finally, our offsetting program, right? So as I mentioned before, we as a company, as a logistics company, have always in mind the first thing you have to do is to make sure that you have full visibility of your carbon emissions so you can account and report properly the carbon emissions produced by your operations, right? Second is, okay, once you have done that, then you have to reduce your carbon emission as much as possible, right? And then the third step is, once you have done step 1, step 2, and then the remaining emissions that you could not avoid or reduce, then they will be offset, right? So the offsetting is nothing more than whatever then tons of CO2 emissions that we produce, we will actually offset in some projects around the world that will absorb these carbon emissions from the atmosphere, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Edgar.
Thanks to you.
Very interesting. Might be some people here in the room who actually might be not aware of the commercial sector going so much into this direction. So that's certainly a good thing to know. And as I said before, it's certainly not only Kuehne + Nagel. I think there's many commercial companies out there that have more and more these services. So I think in terms of selecting your suppliers, in terms of selecting your transport providers, so whoever you work with, I think it's worthwhile to look out for these organizations actually putting this high up on their agenda. Thanks, Edgar.
Thanks.
So Paul, last but not least, as I said, we're traveling more or less down the supply chain. So with the Fleet Forum, certainly some focus on the transportation on the ground. So really glad to have you here with us and to give us some insights into, or give us some opportunities that are out there to reduce emissions also on the ground transportation side. Thank you, Paul.
Great. Thank you, Jonas. As I said, my name is Paul Jansen. I work for Fleet Forum. We are a member association of aid and development organizations, commercial organizations, governmental donors, and academia. And what we do is we try to improve fleet management performance of organizations in low and middle income countries with a very strong focus on ground transport of aid and development organizations. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to give you an overview of what is possible to substantially reduce the environmental impact of transport. It will be in high pace because I will just show you what is possible, where the previous speakers focus more on, let's say, the very important strategic and tactical aspects of reducing environmental impact. I would like to show that very small operational interventions can already have a huge impact on the environmental impact of transport. So, the cleanest transport possible is, of course, no transport at all. Well, in some cases, that's not possible. In some cases, you still, as an organization, do need transport. Then the second step is to ensure that if you have transport, that you limit the number of vehicles that you use and you limit the number of kilometers that you drive. And as third is that the kilometers you drive, do it in the most possible cleanest option, the most environmental friendly or less environmental polluting way that you can imagine. So let us look at some of the wheels you can turn on operationally to really reduce, let's say, the environmental impact of your transport. Let's look into 5 topics: fleet strategies, policies, transport planning, driver management, and vehicles. So fleet strategies enable you to have control over your fleet performance. So also the environmental impact of your transport and your fleet. So centralizing procurement means you control completely the type of vehicles that is being used in your organization. And also looking at, if you outsource your transport, to set requirements for outsourcing partners. So you can control how clean the vehicles you use, how clean they are. If you have a centralized fleet management, you go even one step further. You can also control the usage of your vehicles and can intervene in cases that targets related to fuel consumption, for example, are not met. Internal leasing ensures you that you always have the cleanest vehicles possible, given the circumstances where it's possible to drive them. Fleet sharing, of course, reduces the number of vehicles and reduces the number of kilometers driven, and therefore the impact on the environment. And last is outsourcing is an option to work with partners who might be better able to provide clean transport than if you can do it yourself. If you look at vehicle policies and procedures, that allows you to have complete control over the usage of vehicles. A clean fleet policy, of course, that's where it all starts with, where you set your targets, your ambitions, so everyone in the organization knows where you want to go to. Look at the minimum requirements needed to meet your transport requirements. I think a very known example: don't drive a heavy 4x4 vehicle in cities or in areas where there are proper roads, which is in more and more cases. You can imagine that driving a smaller vehicle in those cases means a substantial reduction of your environmental impact. Look at your fleets. Most fleets of organizations, the size of your fleets, most fleets of organizations are oversized by somewhere between 10 and 15%, which directly means that you drive more kilometers than that you need. Ensure that you replace your vehicles on a frequent basis. Depending on the organization, the type of work you do, somewhere between 4 and 6 years. So you can always ensure that you drive the cleanest vehicle option available in the market at that moment. Fuel policies, of course, support the use of the cleanest fuels available and set targets on it. And well-maintained vehicles drive somewhere between 3 and 7% more fuel efficient than cars that are not maintained very well. If you look at journey planning, that can really limit the kilometers that you drive. If you combine trips, that means that you will substantially save kilometers driven if possible. And if you plan your journey in the right way, you will also reduce the number of kilometers instead of just have individual single trips. Driver management. Recognized drivers will perform better and will be more driven to contribute to more fuel efficient driving and to substantially reduce the environmental impact of their driving. Eco-trained drivers with refresher training will reduce their fuel consumption by around 20%. That is possible. And give drivers control over their own performance. Many organizations still use black boxes, so the drivers do not know how they are being tracked. What the outcome is, give them control over their own performance, and they will be much more engaged and driven to contribute to reduction of environmental impact. Vehicles. Prioritize clean vehicles, the cleanest vehicles possible. There are more and more cleaner vehicles, still, let's say, combustion engine vehicles, but look at what is possible in the market. Cleaner vehicles, of course, produce less carbon emission and also less local pollution. Hybrid vehicles go even one step further because they drive partly on electricity, so they are able to even further reduce the environmental impact and ensure that the electricity you use is always green electricity. And electric vehicles, they have the big advantage that they do not cause local pollution at all. And of course, while driving, also produce less, let's say, carbon emission. So prioritize your clean vehicles. And of course, given the circumstances, what it is possible in the work that you need to do. The good thing about working on cleaning or greening your transport is that once you do that, clean, efficient, effective, and safe go hand in hand. All measures you take to reduce environmental impact will have a positive effect on the others as well. Let me give you some examples. If you drive smaller vehicles in cities and areas where there are good roads, that means not just a reduction of energy consumption, but also a reduction of costs and less severe injuries if you hit someone. Because in most cases, it's third-party parties who are being hit by vehicles of Asian development organizations. And also, last but not least, smaller cars are better for your reputation when people see that you drive more efficient vehicles. Train drivers drive, of course, more fuel efficient. So also a reduction of cost, but they also drive safer because they have a different way of driving. So they cause less accidents, less crashes, and therefore also less costs. If you plan your trips very well, that not only means that you drive less kilometers, less environmental impact, but you're also able to better align your transport with the needs of programs in the field. So if you look at it, these are the questions that you need to answer if you really want to start working on reducing the environmental impact of your fleet, of your transport. Do you really need transport or can you do without? If so, can you limit the number of vehicles? Looking at the part of vehicles that can be replaced by cleaner vehicles. Some cases it's not possible, but in a lot of cases it is, and stretch yourself and challenge yourself to do it. And then review the market. Talk to suppliers, potential suppliers, talk to other organizations to understand what the markets can offer. And of course, it has an impact on your cost. So look at your total cost of ownership and the impact of it. And then in the end, you look at the contribution to reduction of environmental impact. And it all requires a step-by-step approach. Start with data collection and set a baseline. Talk to other organizations, benchmark yourself against other organizations and learn from it, learn from each other. And use these lessons learned to set your ambitions and identify your measures. And then take a decision and start implementing. So what we heard already from previous speakers is that a lot of tools are already there. How to measure the impact, in this case, of your transport, what the impact would be if you would go to cleaner vehicles. There are more and more, let's say, innovations in the car industry as well that allows you to drive with cleaner vehicles. Question is that all the technical solutions, is that enough? Well, we think it's not. Because first it requires leadership. Leadership, top management of organizations should be committed, but also engaged in really reduce the environmental impact of their organization. It should be high on the agenda. And as you all know, any change in an organization will not be cheered by many people because we like to do the things we always did it. And so the second, after, let's say, the technical solutions that are there, leadership is one, and secondly is change management. You need to engage people, convince people, and not just provide technical solutions, but as you know, probably from other examples, that might fail. And third, which is last but definitely not least, I heard it yesterday in the opening session. The Secretary General of the IFRC and the Director General of ICRC both said collaboration is key. not any of the organizations can do it by themselves. So collaboration between organizations and donors, academia and suppliers, it's all important that they all work together to really come up with solutions, but really realize the impact as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for perfectly, I think, summing up the speeches that have been given so far. So we're running a bit late. I guess that's the usual thing to happen, but we still have some time for a number of questions. So I'm not sure how many questions will now come in. I think we should start with the chat function. If you have a simple question that you can just put there, just type it in. If your question requires a bit more explanation, then maybe just also put your name and say, I'm Kai or Sean or whoever, I'm having a question. Then I think you can also speak up. We have quite a number of people here, but not like as many as in the CEO talk. So it should still be possible to have some interaction in the group here. So yeah, I would kindly invite the audience to ask some questions, to address those questions directly to the speakers, and yeah, use the chat function if you actually have a question to ask. While I share my screen. Any questions? Otherwise, I'd go ahead. I have a question for Edgar, actually, who told us about all the different opportunities. I'd be curious how your clients are responding to that. So I can imagine that when you're offering all these different services or different types of emissions that they would be producing, how are they responding to it, especially also when it comes to potentially paying a higher price? Because I can imagine that's a typical issue that is also present in the humanitarian sector. So you can actually potentially go for a cleaner solution, but then in the end, it will be more expensive. So someone has to pay for it. So how is the commercial clients are reacting to that?
Yes, Jonas. As I just mentioned, it's the cleaner solutions obviously bring a higher cost, right? So this is something which not every customer is prepared to pay, right? So it depends a lot on the maturity of the sustainability program of the company, right? That's number one. And second is how embedded is the sustainability as part of the procurement process, right? So I think these two components make the difference when it comes to really using greener services, not only for Kühne + but in general. So our experience is if we go back 10 years ago, many companies, even big companies, big corporations, they were not as ready as they are today, right? So it has been a progressive process in which companies have been pushed either by their consumers or by regulators to take greener measurements, right? So then 10 years back compared to what is happening now, then you see companies, again, especially big corporations, actually investing, paying more for greener solutions. But the range is still very, very small, right? So when that happens for SMEs, then I think we will see a different trend.
Okay, it's going to be a game changer, I think. So thanks, Edgar. We have now a few questions coming in. So ERM is already like having quite a number of questions. So maybe let's start with the measuring bit. Maybe Moritz, would that be a question you could actually start responding to? How could you measure the complete supply chain footprint? I mean, it's a rather broad question, I guess, but just one organization.
That's pretty broad. Well, I mean, we've seen that in Mathieu's presentation, right? The first thing you have to do is to actually know the supply chain and map it. and so you can have an idea of where the impacts come from, and then you can start to measure it, right? And then there are, well, if you go for CO2, there are established or environmental impacts, like we've seen with, I guess Mathieu is the right one to answer that question. You've seen that there are different categories and methods that you can use to measure these different impacts, and emissions are one of that, right? But the most important thing, and this is a critical issue as it can be for a complex product, extremely difficult to do that, is to map the supply chain and really know which impact there are and where they come from. But maybe Mathieu can elaborate on that, I guess.
Yes, maybe over to Matthew. I see the second part is also addressing you directly.
Okay, I take from there. Yes, actually, as was said and what transpired from the different presentation, there are now a lot of standards. Edgar mentioned the GHG protocol. That's right. So we have standards with indicators and how to measure and evaluate carbon emission, at least from our supply chain. The analysis that we took is one that is quite well known, as I said, life cycle assessment, where every component of a product are studied. It is based on a database, international database that do provide the emission of each type of the component and consolidate that all across our supply chain. So actually it's a very well established methodology that we decided also to cross-check with operations, so to make sure that we were able to project this model and to run the numbers appropriately. So measuring a carbon emission, definitely in our experience, would recommend LCA. A lot of externals, or you can outsource that. You can train persons to do it also internally and help your organization in running such thing. But that's the approach we have taken to have this holistic view of our supply chain and also in-depth analysis. So I hope I did answer the question.
The second part is also for you. Do you push supplier to be responsible for end of life?
That's a very tricky question. For me, we are today in a world of extended responsibility. And that's why usually the one in the forefront are the ones to be blamed. As we saw, I think it was in Moritz's speech, the supplier from tier 1 or tier 2, tier 3 are usually not the one to be blamed, but the one that trigger the order. So as of today, we are starting working with some of our suppliers. Some of them are quite mature in terms of greening their approach. And I would not say that we are pushing them. We are working with them to embark with us onto that journey and to adhere to this value that being environmental friendly, also ethical, is part of the working ways we would like to develop with them. So it's more, again, back to the collaboration discussion. It's more discussion than pushing things on them. And that we need also to show to our suppliers that we are walking the talk. So it's very much multilateral.
Thanks, Matthew. One question for Edgar. Do you practice reverse logistics? And what about sailing alternative or hybrid system for shipping?
Yes, we have in Copenhagen. We have a full team dedicated to reverse logistics since many years ago. So this is not new for us. It is a need even before the trend of sustainability was booming. Right, we were already serving customers on reverse logistics, especially the electronic components. Right, and the part of you were asking about sailing. Or using hybrid systems for shipping is still on the testing phase, right? We have approached our carriers to understand where we are in terms of hybrid systems, right? And for example, at the moment, what we have seen is basically mostly using of LNG as a component, right? But not the full ship goes on LNG, but it is partially going on LNG on a certain percentage, and then the rest, which is the majority still, goes in normal fuel, right? So that's it. Electric in the shipping industry is still not happening, right? It's in testing. It's in test only.
Thanks, Edgar. A question from Jacob to Paul. Have you implemented your recommendation to the company? How much did this reduce the environmental impact? And did you experience pushbacks? You're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Jonas. Yes, we definitely did implement it. I did it myself in a previous life when I worked in the corporate sector. And was also responsible for fleet management, where we realized with part of the interventions, implementation of that, a reduction of fuel consumption of about 25%. And you see that the initial measures taken, let's say quick wins, are always around like 10 to 15%. An interesting example is also a number of UN agencies working together, led by UNICEF on a fleet sharing project, where they immediately reduce about 15%, let's say, of their environmental impact, and now moving on to even further reduce it. And we have seen many examples of organizations implementing part of the measures or more measures, and really, let's say, realizing substantial improvements. About the pushback, there, I would say, in any case where you implement measures that changes something from, let's say, the existing situations, you have pushback, and it depends, and it ranges from, like I said, implementing of fleet tracking systems in order to, let's say, monitor fuel consumption to reduce this, will always give huge pushback from drivers if you don't implement it in the right way. Moving to, let's say, from heavy 4x4, heavy duty 4x4 vehicles to normal sedans will give people the feeling that they're not important anymore because they have to drive in a small vehicle now. So there's many examples of where you have pushback. So like with any change, I would say, is change management is extremely important to continue to communicate, explain why it's so important, explain how people can contribute, let's say, to a better world, to a better organization, etc., etc. So you will always have pushbacks. I would say if you don't have pushback, you don't change hard enough.
Okay, that's a fair statement to make. There's a question on the rising of cash assistance in the humanitarian sector. Maybe Matthew, maybe would be the best person to address this one. I'm not sure whether that has played any role in the studies that you have done for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement already. But Claire is asking to what extent that will have an impact, and she's kind of saying that you lose control a bit on your supply chain when you increase the cash assistance side of the humanitarian operation.
Yes, I had a thorough look at Claire's question. Actually, I know it's a very interesting point and tricky, so I will give my view. So cash is something that we have been pushing a lot with great abilities. In terms of supply chain and greening, I think what we have to do is to avoid a shortcut. The point of providing cash is kind of outsourcing the supply chain to someone else. We are not anymore in control, so we cannot say that we know what has been happening with the goods that our beneficiary might purchase through this cash. then for sure it will start to be a little bit into the gray zone and will be problematic for us to explain what's the numbers behind it.
Thanks, Matthew. We are approaching the end of the session, and as I said, we have a few more questions we would like to ask you. So what I suggest that we move on to the survey. I talked to the speakers beforehand though, so any pending question that you still have, and there's quite a few unanswered in the chat, I put my email at the end of the chat, and then we invite you actually to send that email to me, and I will forward it to the team, so you will actually get a response to your pending question. There's two questions though that I still would like to pick out. One is about the emission offsetting, and I find this a really interesting point, and Edgar and I had discussed that also in the past. Offsetting emissions is of course nice to have, but should in the end be only the last resort. So actually avoiding the CO2 emission should be coming first. So that's why I think we are now in the transition phase where you can't reduce it completely, you can't avoid it completely. So the offsetting is I would say a short midterm solution, but in the long run certainly that bit should be reduced, the offsetting, and the actual emission itself should be avoided. I think everyone would agree on that. And then there was one more point that I wanted to pick out. Is from Luc, saying that the presentation is mainly focused on the carbon footprint. Fully agreed on this. The sustainability is actually going beyond CO2 emission, but we wanted to put a certain focus of the discussion on what the speaker is going to be talking about. So on purpose we decided to focus more on the CO2 emission side, but we admit the topic is certainly broader than that. And if you really want to improve sustainability in your supply chain, you should go beyond the CO2 emission part. For us, it seemed to be the most concrete part to actually discuss about. So thank you for these comments. As I said, I will give my email at the end of the chat. And then any pending questions, please feel free to reach out. Also, as I mentioned before, we wanted to actually give you the opportunity to somewhat not stop the discussion after the end of that session. So we have prepared these Mentimeter surveys. I'm just thinking there was quite a number of people who joined the call a bit later, so they did not respond to the Mentimeter questions, the first two Mentimeter questions. So I would give, let me just check. Everyone who has not responded yet to the Mentimeter questions, so briefly actually you go to Mentimeter or menti.com, you put in the code, and then I would say give you a minute or two to respond to these first two questions, which have been answered already by quite a number of those who've been there from the beginning. But then we will jump to the remaining questions, which should somewhat also give us the chance to follow up on certain activities, to also find out who is interested in maybe really taking up some concrete project opportunities to work on that topic in the near future together. So first question is, what sector are you representing? If you could briefly answer this one. I think we had around 60 people in the room, so let's give them some time to respond. Okay. Okay, let's move to the next one. So what was your motivation to attend the session? I guess the motivation is still there. So briefly respond to this one. Would you like to get a better understanding? Would you learn more about ongoing activities? Would you like to engage with others? Or would you really be looking for concrete takeaways and recommendations that lead to projects? So we have in total around 26, now 27. Forms. Good. One. Okay, sorry. So this is now the remaining questions, the importance of sustainability within your organization. So how high up in the organization's agenda is the topic of sustainability in relation to supply chain management? So you can pick between not a priority at all or very essential. That's interesting. Huh? So it's somewhat there as a certain priority, but certainly not the top priority yet. Okay. I think we can move on to the next. So then we are interested, so in case the organization is already looking into some implementation, in what fields would that be? You can pick up to 3 different fields. Is it more on the product management side? Is it the sourcing procurement bit, transportation and storage, the waste management, the reverse logistics, circular supply chains, that as Junji pointed out rightly, has not been fully covered in our session today, but is certainly huge relevance. Measuring, that was mentioned several times, global standards and guidelines that Moritz briefly mentioned in the beginning. So meanwhile, I'm leaving my email in the chat room. So this is pretty much the same fields. This is not from the organization perspective, but more from your personal perspective. So, okay, some people responding. Just approaching the end of the meeting, so I'll move on to the final 2 questions. This is your active interest in greening projects that goes beyond also your organization, meaning how much are you interested in working on joint initiatives with the different sectors and work on something together collaboratively. Okay, I think that's clear. So everyone here, still participating is active. So that would also mean that in the last part, we would like to find out whether you're interested in participating in a joint initiative. So now with Mentimeter, there's some restrictions, so you can not really ask for emails, but here there's a question that you can type in. So we would kindly ask you, if you're interested in follow up on joint initiatives, to put your email in there, and we will start a communication process with you to firstly map out what's already going on, but then also identify concrete opportunities that we can actually embark on. And maybe just as a little gift, we have purchased 50 books, ebooks from Elle McKinn, who moderated the CEO talk yesterday on decarbonizing logistics. So we have 50 copies available. So amongst those who would like to participate in any follow-up discussion, we would actually share those copies with you. If it's more than 50 in the end, we would draw a lot. But as I see now, it would be more or less the sufficient books that we have available for people interested. So that means that our session has come to the end. I would also invite you to the actually follow-up session, which started already 2 minutes ago. It's more on innovation, so I think it's a perfect next session to follow. So if you have the time, if you're interested, please join us in the next call that is moderated and facilitated by the British Red Cross. So thanks everyone, and wishing you a great day and looking forward to collaborating with you in the future. Of course, big thanks to the elevator speakers. I think it was a really great job, really interesting insights that you provided. So take care, stay healthy, and all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you, Jonas.